911, what's your emergency?
911, what's your emergency?
Viewer discretion advised. This program discusses true crime cases and contains sensitive topics, disturbing details, and graphic descriptions that may be upsetting to some viewers. Flashing lights or visual effects may also appear. This content is presented for educational, documentary, and commentary purposes under fair use guidelines outlined in Section 107 of the Copyright Act of 1976. Christian Crossland was only 5 years old when his life came to an end inside an apartment in Portland, Indiana on March 24th, 2022. The case would eventually become one of the most disturbing child abuse homicide prosecutions in recent Indiana history, and would culminate in the Indiana Supreme Court's decision in Crossland v. State in 2025. By the time investigators, medical experts, prosecutors, and judges had finished examining the evidence, they concluded that Christian had endured weeks of starvation, dehydration, isolation, confinement, and physical abuse before his death. The facts presented during trial and later summarized by the Indiana Supreme Court revealed a heartbreaking story of prolonged suffering hidden behind the walls of a family home. Before the events that led to his death, Christian had spent much of his early childhood living away from his mother, Chelsea Crossland. According to court records, Christian lived with a friend of his mother's from approximately the age of 2 until he was 5 years old. The reasons for that arrangement were not the focus of the murder case, but the evidence established that Christian was not living with Chelsea Crossland for a significant portion of his early life. Everything changed in January of 2022 when Christian moved into his mother's apartment. Inside the residence were Chelsea, Crossland, and 4 other young children. What should have been a fresh start and a reunion between mother and son instead became the beginning of the final 74 days of Christian's life. According to testimony presented during trial, Christian was treated very differently from the other children in the household almost immediately after moving into the apartment. Witnesses described a pattern of isolation and punishment that set him apart from everyone else. Siblings testified that Christian was largely confined to Chelsea Crossland's bedroom and forced to sleep on the floor of a closet. He was generally permitted to leave only to use the bathroom. Unlike the other children, he was not allowed to participate in normal family meals. Witnesses stated that he was intentionally kept away from food and that obtaining food became an ongoing struggle for him. The testimony provided by Christian's siblings became some of the most powerful evidence presented during the trial. According to the children, Christian was frequently hungry. Several siblings testified that they secretly attempted to give him food whenever they thought they could do so without being caught. One child described these efforts as extremely risky because of their mother's reactions whenever Christian received food. Another testified that it appeared their mother was intentionally preventing Christian from eating. The evidence suggested that Christian's deprivation was not accidental or the result of simple neglect. Prosecutors argued that it was deliberate. At the same time that Christian was being deprived of food, witnesses described repeated physical abuse. According to testimony later summarized by the Indiana Supreme Court, Christian was struck with hands, belts, and pieces of wood. One sibling described seeing him beaten all over his body. The abuse appeared to occur repeatedly over the course of the weeks he spent living in the apartment. When investigators later asked why Christian was treated differently, the siblings provided various explanations. One child believed that their mother became angry because Christian struggled with educational tasks such as identifying letters and numbers. Another sibling stated that their mother simply seemed not to like him as much as the other children. Regardless of the reason, the evidence presented at trial established that Christian became the primary target of abuse inside the household. As the weeks passed, Christian's physical condition deteriorated dramatically. Medical experts who later examined the case described a child whose body was slowly being consumed by starvation. A child abuse pediatrician testified that Christian appeared to have received almost no meaningful caloric intake during the approximately 74 days he lived in his mother's custody before his death. The doctor testified that Christian's survival under those conditions was remarkable. By the time of his death, Christian weighed only about 20 pounds, despite being 5 years old. Medical experts described him as skeletal. His cheeks were deeply sunken. His eyes appeared recessed into his face. His rib cage protruded visibly through his skin. His body had reached a state of extreme malnutrition, rarely seen outside cases involving severe abuse, famine, or catastrophic neglect. The evidence showed that Christian's deterioration was not hidden. His physical condition would have been obvious to anyone living in the apartment. The starvation occurred gradually over many weeks. It was not something that developed overnight. Prosecutors argued that his appearance alone demonstrated the prolonged nature of the abuse. By the final days of his life, Christian's body had been pushed to the limits of human survival. On March 24, 2022, the situation reached its tragic conclusion. According to testimony presented during trial, Christian was lying in a corner of Chelsea Crossland's bedroom. One of his sisters noticed that his face appeared red and that he was coughing. At some point, Christian fell. The sibling informed their mother. What happened next became one of the most unusual and disturbing details in the case. According to testimony accepted by the jury, Crossland took Christian into the bathroom and attempted to feed him shampoo. Shortly afterward, Christian died. Rather than immediately contacting emergency services, Crossland called her own mother and asked her to come to the apartment. While waiting for her mother to arrive, evidence presented at trial showed that she wrapped Christian's body in a blanket and placed it inside a trash bag. One daughter later testified that Crossland asked whether she should call the police or simply remain quiet about what had happened. Approximately 2 hours passed before emergency services were finally contacted. When first responders arrived at the apartment, they immediately recognized the severity of the situation. Christian's body was found on the bathroom floor. Blood was visible around his face. His extreme emaciation was obvious. Some reports described the apartment as filthy and poorly maintained. Christian was reportedly wearing only a diaper when emergency personnel encountered him. The scene immediately raised suspicions that this was not simply a medical emergency or accidental death. As investigators began interviewing Chelsea Crossland, they encountered a series of conflicting explanations. Initially, she claimed that Christian had fallen and that she immediately sought help. Later, she said she had delayed calling while attempting to perform cardiopulmonary resuscitation. At another point, she suggested that a dead phone battery had prevented her from contacting emergency services sooner. Investigators found numerous inconsistencies in these explanations. Medical experts later reported that they found no evidence supporting her claim that cardiopulmonary resuscitation had been performed. The autopsy became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case. Medical examiners documented injuries throughout Christian's body, including cuts, bruises, and evidence of blunt force trauma. Additional injuries were documented in sensitive areas of the body. The pathologist ultimately concluded that Christian died from a combination of blunt force injuries, starvation, and dehydration. Rather than a single injury causing death, the evidence showed that Christian's body had been weakened over time through repeated abuse and deprivation until it could no longer survive. As investigators continued gathering evidence, the statements from Christian's siblings painted an increasingly troubling picture. Children described repeated beatings, prolonged hunger, confinement, and isolation. The evidence suggested that Christian's suffering had become a normal part of life inside the apartment. According to some reports based on court documents, one child told investigators that Christian sometimes went days without food. Prosecutors argued that the abuse was not a momentary lapse in judgment but a sustained pattern of cruelty extending over weeks. Chelsea Crossland was eventually charged with murder and neglect of a dependent, resulting in death. Prosecutors sought a sentence of life without parole. Under Indiana law, such a sentence required proof of aggravating circumstances. In this case, prosecutors argued that Christian was under the age of 12 and that he had been tortured. During trial, jurors heard testimony from medical experts, investigators, pathologists, and the children who lived inside the apartment. Together, the evidence described a child who had been isolated, starved, beaten, and deprived of basic care over an extended period. After hearing all of the evidence, the jury found Chelsea Crossland guilty of murder. The jurors also found that the aggravating circumstances had been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. They concluded that Christian was under 12 years old and that he had been tortured before his death. Based on those findings, the jury recommended a sentence of life without parole. The trial judge accepted that recommendation and imposed one of the harshest penalties available under Indiana law. During sentencing proceedings, Jay County Coroner Michael Brewster reportedly described Christian's final weeks as a prolonged 74-day horror show. The phrase would later become one of the most widely quoted descriptions of the case because it captured the prosecution's argument that Christian's suffering was not limited to a single day or isolated incident, but instead represented nearly 11 weeks of escalating abuse and neglect. Following her conviction, Chelsea Crossland appealed her case directly to the Indiana Supreme Court. Notably, the appeal did not primarily focus on whether the evidence was sufficient to support the conviction. Instead, her attorneys argued that extensive pretrial publicity had prevented her from receiving a fair trial and that certain evidentiary rulings limited her ability to present a complete defense. The Indiana Supreme Court carefully reviewed the record, including jury selection, witness testimony, and evidentiary issues. In April of 2025, the Indiana Supreme Court unanimously affirmed both the conviction and the sentence. The court concluded that jurors were capable of remaining impartial despite media coverage and found no reversible errors in the trial proceedings. The justices repeatedly referenced the overwhelming evidence presented by prosecutors, including testimony regarding Christian's confinement, starvation, physical abuse, and deteriorating physical condition. The court allowed the conviction and sentence of life without parole to stand. At the center of Crossland v. State was a 5-year-old child who depended entirely on adults for safety, care, food, and protection. According to the evidence accepted by both the jury and Indiana's highest court, Christian spent the final 74 days of his life enduring extreme deprivation, isolation, and abuse. The legal proceedings have concluded, but the case remains a stark example of how severe child abuse can occur behind closed doors, often witnessed only by the children living within the home. Christian Crossland's death ultimately became the subject of one of Indiana's most significant child abuse homicide cases, ending with a conviction, a sentence of life without parole, and a Supreme Court decision that affirmed the jury's findings and closed the final chapter of the legal case.